She was just an old woman, in her daughter-in-law's eyes, useless, weak, and a burden. What Evelyn never knew was that this old woman, her mother-in-law, owned one of the biggest mobile companies in the country, and the truth was about to be revealed in the most unexpected way. Watch till the end to see how respect and humility can change everything, and don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories like this one. Margaret sat in the small living room of her house, knitting slowly as the clock ticked against the wall. The house wasn't poor, far from it. It was large, comfortable, and filled with things she had collected over decades. Yet Margaret herself lived as if she owned nothing. She wore simple cotton dresses, her gray hair tied back neatly in a bun, and her shoes were the same pair she had worn for years. To anyone visiting for the first time, she looked like a woman who lived only on memories, not money, and that was precisely how she preferred it. Her daughter-in-law, Clara, didn't see it that way. Clara had married Margaret's only son, Daniel, 5 years ago. Since then, the house had been full of whispers, criticisms, and the sharp edges of Clara's voice. "You know, Daniel," Clara said loudly from the kitchen that afternoon, "sometimes I wonder why we're still living here. My father could easily help us get a better place, a house that actually looks like it belongs to people of our status." Margaret's hands paused in the air, knitting needles catching on the thread. She glanced up, but she said nothing. Years of practice had taught her the strength of silence. Daniel's response was muted. "Clara, this is my home. It's where I grew up. Mother is comfortable here." "Comfortable?" Clara scoffed, stepping into the living room with her polished heels clicking against the wooden floor. "Daniel, look at her. She doesn't care about appearances. She doesn't care what people think. It's embarrassing sometimes." Margaret smiled faintly, as if the words hadn't struck her, but inside, her heart bent under their weight. She had always known Clara's opinion of her, old-fashioned, unworthy, a burden. "Clara," Daniel sighed, "please, don't say such things." "Why not? It's the truth," Clara insisted. She crossed her arms, tilting her chin upward. "We live here only because of my father's support. Everything we have, this furniture, this life, fits because he helps us. Otherwise, where would we be?" Margaret lowered her eyes to her knitting again, pretending not to hear. But her mind whispered the truth she never spoke aloud. This house, this land, these walls, they were mine long before Clara's father had anything to give. Margaret's days were filled with these moments, small cuts, little humiliations. Clara didn't scream or throw things. She didn't need to. Her words were sharp enough to bruise at breakfast. Clara would sigh when Margaret poured tea. "At least try to use the nice cups when we have guests. People will think we can't afford better." In the evenings, Clara would complain about the curtains. "They look like they're from the last century. Honestly, sometimes I feel like I'm living in a museum." Margaret listened, nodded, and carried on with her quiet chores. Sometimes Daniel defended her, but most of the time, he stayed quiet. He loved his wife, and Margaret never wanted to force him into a corner. So she accepted his silence as part of her sacrifice. But when she lay awake at night, staring at the ceiling, she couldn't help but wonder, how did my own home become the place where I am treated like a stranger? What Clara never understood was that Margaret had chosen simplicity, not poverty. She could have worn jewels, fine clothes, and walked with her head high in the circles of power. She had once been a woman of great stature, a woman whose name carried weight in boardrooms and across markets. But she had stepped away, quietly, deliberately. Her wealth remained, but hidden. Her influence, carefully tucked away. Now, she found her joy in the little things. The smell of bread baking in the oven, the sound of birds on the window, the soft touch of yarn between her fingers. Yet every cruel remark from Clara was a reminder of how misunderstood she had become. One evening, when relatives visited for dinner, Clara made sure to highlight Margaret's simplicity. "Mother-in-law insists on wearing the same dress again," Clara announced with a forced laugh as the guests arrived. "She says it's her favorite, but honestly, I think it's the only one she has left." The guests chuckled awkwardly, unsure how to respond. Margaret only smiled, serving them tea with steady hands. Inside, though, she felt her dignity slipping away like water through her fingers. If only they knew, she thought, her eyes glancing toward a small locked drawer in her room upstairs. Inside it were documents, proof of a life Clara could not even imagine. Proof of companies, investments, and partnerships that had built empires. Proof that Margaret was far from the helpless old woman Clara thought she was. But she stayed silent later that night. When the guests had left, Daniel noticed his mother cleaning the dishes while Clara scrolled through her phone. Mother, you don't have to do that. Clara and I can manage. Margaret gave him a gentle smile. It's all right, son. I've been doing this all my life. It's no burden. But Daniel didn't see the exhaustion in her shoulders, or the way she swallowed her hurt. His love for his wife blinded him to the cracks forming in his mother's heart. That night, as she sat by the window, Margaret whispered to herself, "They think I have nothing. They think I am nothing. But one day, they will know that dignity is not measured in money or dresses. And when that day comes, I pray I still have the strength to forgive." The moonlight fell across her face, softening the lines of age. She closed her eyes, allowing the silence to comfort her. But somewhere deep inside, a quiet storm was waiting. The following morning dawned quiet in the small town where Margaret lived with her son and his wife. Sunlight filtered through the lace curtains of her modest but elegant living room. Everything inside the house was neat and warm, yet her heart carried the weight of years of unspoken words. Margaret's routine was simple. She woke early, prepared tea, and sat by the window where she used to watch her husband walk to work decades ago. Life had changed, but her discipline never left her. Eleanor, her daughter-in-law, woke up later than usual. The clatter of high heels against the marble floor soon echoed in the house, breaking Margaret's peaceful silence. Eleanor had a sharp tongue and little patience for anyone, least of all her aging mother. "Margaret, why didn't you prepare breakfast? Do you expect me to live like a servant in my own house?" she complained, her voice piercing the morning calm. Margaret said nothing, only lowered her eyes and quietly placed a plate of toast on the table. Silence was her defense, though silence often gave Eleanor more power. Margaret's son, Daniel, entered the room a few minutes later, his tie slightly crooked, his eyes tired from long nights of work. He looked at his mother briefly, then at his wife, and sighed. "Eleanor, please, don't start the morning with arguments," he muttered. But his words had little effect. Eleanor rolled her eyes dramatically and continued criticizing the older woman. Daniel often found himself caught between loyalty to his wife and respect for his mother. In most cases, he chose to stay silent, and that silence broke Margaret's heart more than Eleanor's insults. After breakfast, Margaret went to her small study room upstairs. Books lined the shelves, many of them about business, economics, and communication. They were remnants of her earlier life, another life that nobody in this house knew about. Margaret ran her hand gently over the spines of the books, remembering boardroom meetings, late-night calls, and the empire she had once built. She had founded Telenet, a telecommunications company that grew into one of the largest mobile networks in the region. But she had walked away from it, leaving it in trusted hands after her husband's death, choosing a life of simplicity instead. Her son and his wife never knew. To them, Margaret was simply an old widow who depended on her son's roof. They did not realize she still received income quietly, still owned a vast fortune, and was still respected in circles Eleanor could only dream of entering. Margaret had chosen humility, but humility often led others to misjudge her. Later that day, Daniel and Eleanor received an invitation to a grand anniversary celebration at the local city hall. The event was organized by one of the most influential families in town, the Reynolds family. Eleanor was thrilled. She lived for such events where she could display her expensive dresses and mingle with people of importance. She bought a new gown for the occasion and spent hours in front of the mirror. "Daniel, tonight people will see us as who we truly are, not small-town nobodies, but part of high society," she said proudly. Margaret listened quietly from her chair, her knitting needles moving slowly. She had no plans to attend. Events like these reminded her of the world she had left behind, and she preferred peace over attention. But Eleanor looked at her with a smirk. "Of course, you won't be coming. It would be embarrassing to have someone so plain by our side," she remarked cruelly. Daniel did not protest. Margaret only smiled gently and nodded. She had grown used to such words, though they cut deep as evening approached. Margaret remained at home, sipping tea, when memories overwhelmed her. She remembered the last time she had attended a grand event. It was 15 years ago, before her husband's passing. They had stood side by side, respected by all, admired for their achievements. Margaret closed her eyes, tears forming, not because she missed the glory, but because she missed the companionship of the man who had always seen her worth. Meanwhile, Daniel and Eleanor arrived at the event. The hall was magnificent, decorated with golden drapes and crystal chandeliers. Influential figures from business and politics filled the room. Eleanor walked confidently, smiling at everyone, while Daniel stayed reserved. They were soon introduced to Mr. James Reynolds, the head of the Reynolds family, and several other guests. Among them was a man in his early 60s, dressed in a sharp black suit. His hair had turned gray, but his posture was strong. This was Mr. Howard Blake, the regional manager of Telenet, the very company Margaret had founded years ago. Howard greeted the guests politely, but when his eyes fell on a photo displayed in Eleanor's purse, a casual family photo where Margaret stood in the background, he froze. His eyes widened, and he whispered, "That woman, is she related to you?" Eleanor frowned, confused. "That old woman, she's my mother-in-law," she asked dismissively. Howard's demeanor immediately changed. He straightened his back and said with genuine respect, "Madame Margaret is your mother. Then I owe your family the deepest respect. She is not just any woman, she is the founder of the company. I've served for 35 years. His words stunned everyone nearby. Daniel blinked in shock, unable to speak, while Eleanor's face turned pale. She had never heard such a thing before. The news spread quickly among the guests. People who had ignored Daniel and Eleanor earlier now approached them with curiosity. "Is it true? Your mother is Margaret Winters, the founder of they asked. Eleanor forced a smile, trying to mask her disbelief, but inside her mind was racing. All this time, she had mocked and belittled her mother-in-law, not knowing the truth about her. Back at home, Margaret sat quietly, unaware of the scene unfolding at the event. She gazed at the clock, wondering if her son and his wife were enjoying themselves. She did not know that, at that very moment, her name was being spoken with admiration, and her humble image was being reshaped in the eyes of those who once overlooked her family. When Daniel and Eleanor returned later that night, silence filled the house. Eleanor did not shout or criticize. She was too shaken by what she had learned. Margaret noticed the change but said nothing, continuing her routine with calm dignity. Eleanor lay awake that night, her thoughts tangled with regret, shame, and confusion. She realized she had built her sense of superiority on lies, while the woman she had scorned possessed both wealth and wisdom beyond her imagination. The seeds of transformation had been planted. What began as a night of glamour for Eleanor ended as a night of revelation. And for Margaret, the storm that had brewed for years was about to bring unexpected clarity, not through revenge, but through the power of truth and humility. The morning after the grand event, the Winters house carried a strange silence. Margaret noticed it immediately. Usually Eleanor's voice echoed through the hall's complaints about breakfast, the laundry, or some minor inconvenience. But today, the young woman avoided eye contact, moving quietly around the kitchen. Daniel, too, seemed distracted, his mind replaying the words he had heard the night before. "She is the founder of Telenet." Margaret poured tea for herself, her movements calm and deliberate. She sat at the dining table, her eyes wandering to the garden outside. Eleanor entered the room, carrying her phone, and for the first time in years, she spoke softly. "Would you like me to make you some eggs, Margaret?" The older woman looked up in mild surprise but only smiled politely. "No, dear, tea will do." Daniel joined them, his tie already knotted, though his hands trembled slightly. He wanted to ask his mother the truth, but the weight of shame held him back. All those years of allowing Eleanor to disrespect her, all those years of assuming she was just a dependent old widow, it now seemed like a betrayal of his own blood. But Daniel lacked courage, and silence was easier than confrontation. Eleanor, however, was restless. She could not sleep the previous night. Howard's words had burned themselves into her memory. She had bragged countless times that her father's wealth had given her everything, that Margaret had nothing of her own. But if what Howard said was true, then the foundation of Eleanor's pride was nothing but dust. She glanced at Margaret nervously, as though trying to see the powerful businesswoman beneath the simple cardigan and silver hair. Later that day, Eleanor called her father, Mr. Collins. Her voice trembled slightly. "Dad, last night, something happened. At the Reynolds event, one of the guests recognized Margaret. He said she founded Telenet. Is that true?" On the other end of the line, Mr. Collins hesitated. His tone shifted from casual to serious. "Eleanor, listen carefully. That woman, Margaret Winters, yes, she is the founder. When I was a young man struggling to find work, she gave me a job. I started at the bottom, and today I'm a manager because of her company. I owe her everything. You must never disrespect her again. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. She had mocked the very woman who gave her father his livelihood. Her hands shook as she ended the call. For the first time in years, shame replaced arrogance, but shame also turned into fear. If Margaret truly was wealthy and influential, what if she decided to punish Eleanor for her cruelty? That evening, Daniel approached his mother timidly. He sat across from her in the study room where the shelves were lined with old books. Margaret looked at him gently. "What is it, son?" she asked. Daniel swallowed hard. "Mother, last night at the event, people said something about you, about Telenet. Is it true? Were you really the founder?" Margaret's hands paused over her knitting. She looked at her son with calm eyes. "Yes, Daniel. Your father and I built that company together. After he passed, I managed it alone for years. But I stepped away when I realized money could not fill the emptiness in my heart. I left it in trusted hands." Daniel's throat tightened. "Why didn't you tell us?" Margaret smiled faintly. "Because I wanted you to live freely, without the burden of my past. Wealth can build walls between people. I wanted to be known as your mother, not as a name on a business empire." Daniel lowered his head, guilt pressing heavily on his chest. He remembered the times Eleanor insulted Margaret in front of him, and how he had done nothing. His silence had been a shield for his marriage, but a knife in his mother's heart. Meanwhile, Eleanor listened from the hallway, her hands gripping the wall. Every word was a reminder of her mistakes. She felt smaller with each passing moment. For years, she had believed she was superior, that her father's wealth gave her the right to treat Margaret as an unwanted guest. But, in truth, Margaret was the reason her own family lived comfortably. That night, Eleanor approached Margaret hesitantly. She found her sitting by the window with her cup of tea. "Margaret," she whispered, her voice breaking, I didn't know. Please, believe me, I didn't know." Margaret turned to her, her eyes kind but firm. "Didn't know what, Eleanor? That I was wealthy, or that kindness matters more than wealth?" Eleanor's lips trembled. She wanted to apologize, to fall at Margaret's feet and beg forgiveness, but pride still lingered, clinging to her like chains. "Instead," she said, I'll do better from now on." Margaret studied her for a moment before turning back to the window. "Do better because it is right, not because you are afraid," she said softly. Days passed, but the atmosphere in the house had shifted. Eleanor began small gestures, helping with chores, speaking respectfully, even offering to make tea, but the sincerity of her actions was unclear. Was it true change, or was it fear of being cut off from Margaret's hidden wealth? The turning point came 1 week later when Margaret received an invitation to the Telenet headquarters. They were celebrating the company's 40th anniversary, and the board wanted her presence as the founder. Margaret hesitated at first, but finally agreed. When Eleanor heard about the event, her stomach twisted. This was not just a family secret anymore, this was public. The world would see Margaret not as a weak old woman, but as a figure of power, and Eleanor, who had humiliated her countless times, would be exposed as a hypocrite on the day of the anniversary. Margaret dressed simply in a navy blue gown, her silver hair pinned neatly. She carried no jewelry except a gold locket her husband had given her years ago. When she entered the grand hall of the headquarters, employees, managers, and directors stood up in respect. Howard himself rushed forward, bowing slightly. "Madam Winters, welcome home," he said warmly. Daniel walked beside his mother, awe written across his face. Eleanor followed behind, her head lowered, too embarrassed to meet anyone's gaze. Cameras flashed, and whispers filled the hall. Some people recognized Eleanor from previous social events, remembering her arrogance, and now seeing her humbled beside the woman she had scorned. Margaret gave a speech that evening, her voice steady but gentle. She spoke not of profits or power but of values, respect, humility, and integrity. "A company is not built by towers of glass or rivers of money," she said. "It is built by people, and by the way we treat one another. Wealth fades, but kindness endures." Her words drew thunderous applause. Eleanor's cheeks burned as she realized those words were directed at her as much as they were for the audience. That night, Eleanor sat in her room, tears finally breaking through her pride. For the first time in her life, she questioned everything: her values, her arrogance, her definition of respect, and though Margaret had not humiliated her, the weight of her own conscience crushed her more than any punishment ever could. The cracks in Eleanor's illusion had widened. What she did next would decide whether she remained a woman of pride or transformed into someone worthy of the family she had so often belittled. The night after the Telenet anniversary, the Winters house was wrapped in a silence that felt different from the usual. It wasn't the silence of disdain, nor of indifference. It was heavy, like the silence that follows after a storm has passed, when the wreckage becomes clear. Margaret sat in her usual chair by the window, knitting needles in her hands, though her mind was elsewhere. She had delivered her speech with grace, but her heart was not proud, it was weary. Daniel walked past her room and paused. He saw his mother framed against the dim lamplight, her silver hair glowing softly. He wanted to tell her how proud he was, how ashamed he felt for never asking about her life before, but words caught in his throat. Guilt often weighs heavier than stones, and Daniel carried years of it. He turned away, leaving his confession unspoken. Eleanor, however, could not sleep. She tossed in her bed, her mind replaying every cruel word she had ever thrown at Margaret, every sneer, every dismissal, every petty insult. They rose like ghosts in the dark. The image of Howard bowing respectfully before Margaret haunted her. It was as if the universe had revealed how blind she had been. Her pride, once a shield, now felt like chains pulling her down. The next morning, Eleanor woke earlier than Margaret for the first time. She went to the kitchen and began preparing breakfast clumsily. The sound of utensils startled Margaret when she entered the room. "Eleanor?" she asked softly. Eleanor turned quickly, her face flushed. "I thought I'd make breakfast today," she said, avoiding eye contact. Margaret tilted her head, sensing the conflict within her. "That's thoughtful, dear," she replied, sitting down at the table. Eleanor placed the eggs on the plate, her hands trembling. It wasn't just breakfast, it was her first attempt at an apology. But apologies spoken through action require patience to be believed. Margaret ate quietly, neither praising nor criticizing. She knew sincerity needed time to prove itself. Later that day, Eleanor visited her father, Mr. Collins. She found him in his office, surrounded by stacks of paperwork. His hair had grown whiter, but his eyes were as sharp as ever. "Dad," she began nervously, "I've made a terrible mistake. I've treated Margaret horribly. And all this time, she was the reason you even had a career. I feel so ashamed." Mr. Collins leaned back in his chair and sighed. "Eleanor, I raised you with comfort, but perhaps too much comfort made you blind. Margaret is not just a businesswoman, she is a woman of honor. She could have flaunted her wealth but chose humility. And you, instead of respecting her, mocked her. Do you see how far you've fallen from true values?" Eleanor's eyes welled with tears. "I do, Father. But how do I fix it? How do I undo years of cruelty?" Her father's gaze softened. "By changing, Eleanor, not for wealth, not for fear, but because it's right. Start with humility. Apologize not with words alone but with your actions. Earn her trust again. And remember, this true respect is not demanded. It is given freely through love." That night, Eleanor sat beside Margaret's chair in the living room, a place she had never chosen before. "Margaret," she whispered, her voice fragile, "I need to say something." Margaret looked up from her knitting, her eyes calm but unreadable. "Go on." "I've been cruel to you," Eleanor confessed, tears threatening to spill. "I thought everything I had came from my father, from his hard work. I thought you were just living here because you had nowhere else to go. But I was wrong. So wrong. And even if you had nothing, I should never have treated you the way I did." Margaret set down her knitting and folded her hands gently. For a long moment, she said nothing. Eleanor feared the silence more than anger. Finally, Margaret spoke. "Eleanor, regret is the beginning of change, not the end. Words matter, but actions reveal the truth. If you want to honor me, live with kindness, not just toward me, but toward everyone." Eleanor nodded, though her tears made it difficult to see. "I will," she whispered. In the days that followed, Eleanor truly tried. She accompanied Margaret on her morning walks, listened to her stories, and helped with household chores without complaint. At first, Daniel watched with suspicion, unsure if this was genuine or simply a performance. But slowly, even he began to notice subtle differences. Eleanor's voice grew softer, her impatience less sharp. She began treating the staff with respect, greeting neighbors with warmth. One Sunday morning, Margaret invited Eleanor to the garden. They sat together under the blooming cherry tree. "You know, Eleanor," Margaret said softly, "life has a way of humbling us. Wealth, beauty, power, they are all fragile. But the way you treat people, that's what lasts." Even when my company was at its peak, I reminded myself daily, respect cannot be bought, only earned. Eleanor lowered her eyes. "I wish I had learned that earlier." Margaret smiled faintly. "You are learning it now. That's what matters." But despite Eleanor's efforts, not everyone was quick to forgive. At the next community gathering, whispers followed her. People remembered her arrogance and cruelty. They eyed her new politeness with suspicion, wondering if it was merely a mask. Eleanor felt their judgment like daggers, but Margaret, standing by her side, leaned over and whispered, "Do not seek validation from them. Seek it from your own conscience." The greatest test of Eleanor's sincerity came unexpectedly. One afternoon, Margaret received a letter from the Telenet board, requesting her input on a major decision about international expansion. She had not been directly involved in years, but they valued her wisdom. Margaret decided to attend the board meeting and invited Daniel and Eleanor to accompany her. At the meeting, board members welcomed Margaret warmly. They addressed her as Madam Winters with deep respect. Eleanor, sitting quietly at the edge of the room, watched in awe. For the first time, she saw Margaret in her true element, not as a fragile old woman, but as a leader, commanding respect through humility and intelligence. During a break, one of the younger directors approached Eleanor. "You're Margaret's daughter-in-law, right?" he asked. Eleanor nodded nervously. "Then you must be very proud," he continued. Pride, the very thing Eleanor had once clung to so arrogantly, now stung her like a wound. She smiled faintly and replied, "I am, but I am also ashamed, because I never treated her the way she deserves." The director tilted his head curiously. "Then you are lucky. Most people never realize their mistakes until it's too late. You still have time." Those words sank deep into Eleanor's heart. That night, as they returned home, Eleanor sat beside Margaret once more. "You've given me more chances than I deserve," she said softly. Margaret patted her hand gently. "We all stumble, Eleanor. What matters is whether we rise with grace." For the first time since her marriage, Eleanor felt a sense of peace, not because of wealth or status, but because she had begun to shed the weight of arrogance. Yet deep inside, she knew her journey was far from over. True transformation was not about a week or a month of good behavior. It was about living differently for the rest of her life. And as she looked at Margaret's calm, wise face under the soft glow of the lamp, Eleanor realized something that shook her to the core. She didn't just want to be forgiven. She wanted to become a woman Margaret could one day be proud of. Weeks passed, and the Winters household felt different. The harshness that once dominated its walls had softened. Eleanor, though still haunted by guilt, worked every day to prove her change was real. She cooked meals for Margaret, helped her in the garden, and even accompanied her to community events. People noticed her gentler manner, though many still whispered behind her back, "She's only pretending. She wants the old woman's money." Eleanor heard those whispers and felt their sting, but she did not respond. Instead, she reminded herself of Margaret's words, "Do better because it is right, not because you are afraid." For once, she was trying to live by that principle. But life has a way of testing change, and Eleanor's test came sooner than she expected. One Friday morning, Daniel returned home from work earlier than usual. His face was pale, his shoulders heavy with tension. Margaret noticed it instantly. "What troubles you, son?" she asked gently. Daniel hesitated, then spoke. "There's been talk in the company about restructuring. My position might be at risk." Eleanor's chest tightened. Daniel's salary was their main source of income. For years, she had boasted of their lifestyle, flaunting designer clothes and expensive dinners. Now, the possibility of losing it all terrified her. Her first instinct was panic. "What do you mean, at risk? How will we manage? What will people think?" Margaret raised her hand calmly. "Eleanor," she said softly, "this is not the time to think of appearances. This is the time to stand by each other." Eleanor swallowed her fear and nodded, though her mind swirled with anxiety. That night she lay awake beside Daniel, staring at the ceiling. In the past, she would have blamed him, accused him of not working hard enough, of failing her expectations. But now, she turned toward him and whispered, "Whatever happens, we'll face it together." Daniel looked at her, surprised, and for the first time in years, saw genuine support in her eyes. 2 weeks later, the storm struck. Daniel was called into the office and officially informed his position had been eliminated. He walked home slowly, the weight of failure pressing down on him. When he entered the house, Eleanor met him at the door. Her heart pounded, but she remembered her promise. She placed a hand on his arm and said, "It's okay, we'll find a way forward." Margaret, sitting quietly in the living room, observed everything. She saw the fear in Eleanor's eyes, but also the determination. This was Eleanor's trial, whether she would return to arrogance and blame, or whether she would stand firm in humility and love. Days turned into weeks, and finances grew tight. Eleanor sold some of her jewelry, not for luxury, but to pay bills. She cut down on her expensive shopping trips, learning to cook simple meals instead of dining out. At first, it felt humiliating, but gradually, Eleanor discovered something unexpected, a quiet sense of peace. Without the constant need to show off, life felt less like a performance and more like reality. One evening, Margaret invited Eleanor to sit with her in the study. She pulled out an old wooden box and handed it to her. Inside were letters, photos, and documents, reminders of Margaret's years building. Eleanor carefully lifted a photo of Margaret and her late husband, standing proudly in front of the company's first office. "You see, Eleanor," Margaret began, "we started with nothing. Your father-in-law and I built everything brick by brick, mistake by mistake. We faced failures too, times when we didn't know if the company would survive, but we endured because we had each other. That is wealth greater than money." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. "I used to think respect came from power, from showing off what we had. But I see now, I was wrong. You and Daniel built your lives on love and trust. I built mine on pride, and when pride crumbles, nothing is left." Margaret placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Not nothing, Eleanor. You still have time to build something stronger. Humility, compassion, resilience, these are bricks that last longer than gold." The very next day, Eleanor faced her harshest test yet. While shopping at the market, she ran into several women from the community, the same women she had once tried to impress. They smirked at her modest clothing and whispered loudly enough for her to hear. Well, looks like the queen has lost her crown," one of them said. "I heard her husband lost his job. Let's see how long she lasts without money," another sneered. The old Eleanor would have snapped back, lashing out with cruel words, but this time, Eleanor took a deep breath. She met their eyes calmly and said, "You're right. We are struggling, but I am learning what really matters. And believe me, it's not the size of your house or the label on your dress." The women blinked in surprise, not expecting such humility. Eleanor walked away, her hands trembling but her heart strangely light. For the first time, she had defended herself not with arrogance, but with truth. That evening, when she told Margaret what happened, the older woman smiled warmly. "That is strength, Eleanor. To stay gentle when you are wounded, that is true dignity." Daniel, too, began to see a transformation in his wife. For years, he had felt crushed by her constant criticism, her endless comparisons. Now, he found comfort in her presence. One night, he took her hand and whispered, "Thank you for standing by me. I don't deserve your patience." Eleanor squeezed his hand, tears shining in her eyes. "No, Daniel, I don't deserve yours, but maybe together, we can become better than we were." Margaret watched this shift quietly, her heart swelling with both pride and relief. She knew Eleanor's journey was not complete, but the fire had refined her. She was no longer the woman who mocked and belittled. She was learning the hardest lesson of all, that love without humility is hollow, and pride without kindness is poison. One evening, as the three of them sat together in the garden, Margaret spoke softly, almost to herself. "Life tests us not to break us, but to show us who we really are." Eleanor looked at her, her voice trembling but steady. "And who I really am, I'm still learning, but I want to be someone worthy of this family." For Margaret, those words were worth more than any empire she had ever built. For Daniel, they were the promise of a marriage reborn. And for Eleanor, they were the first steps toward a future no longer chained to arrogance, but guided by grace. The silence in the banquet hall was suffocating. Eyes darted between Margaret and Evelyn, between truth and humiliation, between the weight of pride and the reality of who truly deserved respect. Evelyn's father still stood beside Margaret, almost protectively, as though the old woman's dignity mattered more than anything else in that moment. For Evelyn, the ground felt like it was slipping beneath her feet. She looked around the room. Her friends, once so eager to laugh with her, now stared with a mixture of pity and judgment. The same women who used to admire her sharp tongue and sense of superiority were whispering behind their hands. Evelyn had never imagined that she, of all people, could be so publicly undone, not by scandal or mistake, but by her own ignorance. Margaret, meanwhile, sat serenely, her posture unchanged. Her hands rested gently on her lap, her eyes calm and unbothered, as if she had been waiting for this moment her entire life. But there was no triumph in her face, no gloating, no revenge. Instead, there was something softer, compassion, that came only from wisdom. After a long pause, Margaret spoke, her voice carrying through the hall, firm yet gentle. "Respect," she began, "is not bought with wealth, nor demanded with authority. It is earned with kindness, humility, and how we treat those who can give us nothing in return." Her words fell like a weight over the room. Guests stopped whispering. Even the servers, who had been busy collecting glasses and refilling trays, froze to listen. Evelyn swallowed hard. Each word pierced her pride, forcing her to confront the ugly truth of her own behavior. Evelyn's father turned toward her, his face etched with disappointment. "All these years," he muttered, "you told me this woman was a burden, yet she's the very reason my career existed. You let your arrogance blind you." His tone carried not just disapproval, but shame. Father embarrassed by his daughter's cruelty. Evelyn wanted to shrink into the floor. For the first time, she wished no one could see her, no one could remember this day. But humiliation, once unleashed, could not be undone. Richard stepped forward, his voice breaking the silence. "Mother," he said softly, his eyes shining with guilt, "I failed you." I let her words and her disdain go unchecked. I thought I was protecting peace in my household, but in truth, I was letting you suffer in silence. Please forgive me." Margaret turned her gaze toward him. "Richard," she replied, "my forgiveness has always been yours. But understand, this silence in the face of cruelty is its own kind of cruelty." Her words hit him harder than any rebuke. Richard lowered his head, tears stinging his eyes. He knew she was right. His desire to avoid conflict had allowed Evelyn's venom to grow unchecked, and in the process, he had betrayed the very woman who raised him. Evelyn, desperate to salvage something, anything, finally broke down. I didn't know," she whispered, her voice trembling. I thought all of this was from my father's hard work. I thought you were just old, insignificant." Her words trailed off, her shame choking her. Margaret sighed, shaking her head slightly. "Even if I had nothing, Evelyn, even if I had not built companies or wealth, that does not give you the right to treat another human being with cruelty. Respect should not be conditional." The truth was undeniable. Evelyn's entire world, her pride, her identity, was built on assumptions and arrogance, and in one evening, those illusions crumbled. The banquet slowly resumed its rhythm. Guests returned to their meals, though the air was heavy with reflection. Conversations were quieter now, more subdued, as if Margaret's words had touched more than just her family. When the evening drew to a close, Margaret stood, preparing to leave. Evelyn's father escorted her to the exit, bowing once more with sincere respect. Richard and Evelyn followed, their hearts heavy with guilt and realization. Outside, the night air was cool, the city lights casting a glow against the pavement. Margaret paused before stepping into the car that waited for her. She turned to Evelyn one final time. "You have a choice," she said softly. "You can let shame consume you, or you can let it transform you. Remember, money fades, status changes, but the way we treat others defines us long after we are gone." Evelyn's eyes filled with tears. For the first time in years, she felt small, not in the way she had mocked Margaret, but in the way a child feels when confronted with the truth. She nodded, unable to speak. Margaret smiled faintly, not with triumph, but with grace, and stepped into the car. As it drove away, Evelyn stood frozen, her father's words, Richard's guilt, and Margaret's lesson echoing in her mind. That night, Evelyn lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. Every insult, every cruel remark she had ever made to Margaret replayed in her head. She realized now how wrong she had been, not just about her mother-in-law's status, but about life itself. Respect, she finally understood, was not demanded, was given freely to those who deserved it, and Margaret, with her quiet dignity, had always deserved it. Sometimes, those we underestimate the most carry the deepest strength and wisdom. True respect has nothing to do with money or status. It lives in our actions, our humility, and our compassion. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to our channel and watch the full journey unfold in our long videos. Every story we share carries a lesson worth remembering.